When the greatest opera tenor in the world told Whitney Houston that pop singing wasn't real singing, nobody expected what happened next. What unfolded in that empty Italian opera house became the most legendary vocal moment never recorded and proved that genius speaks every language. Make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell, because stories like this remind us why true artists transcend genre wars. It was June 1996. Pavarotti and Friends charity concert in Modena, Italy. The annual event brought together classical and pop artists to raise money for war child and other humanitarian causes. That year's lineup was extraordinary. Luciano Pavarotti, the undisputed king of opera, sharing the stage with pop royalty including Elton John, Eric Clapton, and Whitney Houston. But backstage before the performance, something was brewing. Something that would challenge everything the classical music world believed about real singing. Pavarotti had never particularly respected pop vocalists. Oh, he was diplomatic in public. He had to be. These were charity concerts after all. But privately, among his opera colleagues, he made his views clear. Pop singing was entertainment. Opera was RT. Pop singers used microphones, studio tricks, auto-tune. Opera singers had to fill 3,000-seat halls with only the power of their natural voice. This was real singing. Everything else was just amplified talking. Whitney Houston knew about Pavarotti's views. Everyone in the music industry did. The classical world had always looked down on pop, and the greatest living tenor wasn't shy about maintaining that hierarchy. But Whitney had agreed to perform at Pavarotti and Friends anyway. Not because she needed the exposure. By 1996, she was already one of the biggest stars on the planet. She did it because it was for charity. And because, deep down, she had something to prove. The Teatro Pavarotti backstage was old world opera territory. Stone walls, acoustic perfection designed for voices that needed no electronic enhancement. The air itself felt weighted with centuries of classical tradition. Whitney was in her dressing room doing vocal warm-ups when there was a knock. Pavarotti's assistant had a message. The Maestro would like to speak with Miss Houston. This wasn't a request. It was a summons. Whitney found Pavarotti in the wings, reviewing the program. When he saw her, he smiled. That famous Pavarotti smile. But there was something else in his eyes. Curiosity, yes, but also bemused skepticism. Miss Houston, he said warmly, his English heavily accented, I am very happy you are here tonight. Tell me, his tone shifted, have you ever sung without the microphone? Without amplification? In opera, we must fill halls with only our voice. No electronics. This is real singing, you understand? What you do, it is very nice, very commercial, but different, no? There it was, said with a smile, delivered with old-world charm, but the message was unmistakable. You're not a real singer. You're an entertainer who needs technology to sound good. Whitney felt something familiar rise in her chest. She'd felt it before, when rock critics dismissed her music as too safe, when R&B purists said she sounded white, when everyone had an opinion about what real singing was supposed to be. Everyone was an expert on what she was doing wrong. But this time was different. This time, she wasn't going to smile and nod. Maestro, Whitney said carefully, with respect, may I show you something? Pavarotti looked intrigued. Of course. Not here. In the opera house. The main stage. Just you, me, and the acoustics. No microphones, no sound system. Would you give me 10 minutes? Now Pavarotti was very interested. His conductor looked concerned. They had a show to prepare, a tight schedule. But Pavarotti waved him off. Yes, I want to see this. Come. They walked through backstage corridors, Pavarotti leading with the confidence of a man who owned every opera house he entered. When they emerged onto the stage, Whitney felt the space open around her. The house was dark, seats empty, but the acoustics were immediately apparent. This space was designed for the human voice to bloom, to fill every corner with resonance. No amplification needed. This was where Pavarotti's genius lived. So, Pavarotti said, gesturing to the stage, show me what you want to show me. Whitney walked to center stage. Pavarotti remained in the wings with his conductor and a few curious stagehands who had gathered to watch. Word was spreading, La Houston was about to sing for El Maestro, without a microphone. Maestro, Whitney called out, her speaking voice already carrying beautifully in the space. I'm going to sing something you know very well, and then I'm going to ask you a question. Deal? Pavarotti smiled indulgently. Deal. Whitney closed her eyes, took a breath, and sang, O Mio Babbino Caro, Puccini, one of the most beloved arias in opera, sung by Maria Callas, Renata Tebaldi, every great soprano, and Whitney Houston sang it in perfect Italian, with no microphone, in Pavarotti's own opera house. The conductor's mouth fell open, Pavarotti's eyebrows raised. Whitney wasn't just singing the notes, she was interpreting them. Her diction was clear, learned phonetically with a language coach, and her voice was filling the hall exactly as an opera singer's would. Mask resonance, soft palate lifted, sound floating forward, not pushed. This was proper opera singing. But then something happened that Pavarotti had never heard before. Whitney finished the main melody of the aria, perfectly, beautifully, classically. And then she did something that should have been sacrilege but somehow wasn't. She took that same Puccini melody and she turned it into gospel music. The run started, those melismatic phrases that are the signature of Black American gospel singing. But she wasn't abandoning the Italian text. She was embellishing it with gospel ornamentation. The same way a jazz musician might take a standard melody and improvise around it, Whitney was taking Puccini and filtering it through the New Hope Baptist Church in Newark, New Jersey. She added a belt where opera singers would use head voice. She added a growl that no classical soprano would dare attempt. She added blue notes, those slightly flat thirds that give gospel and blues their emotional ache. She made Puccini soul music, and somehow, impossibly, it worked. The classical purity of the opening established her credibility. The gospel transformation proved her artistry. She was showing Pavarotti that there wasn't one way to honor beautiful music. There were many ways. And gospel was just as legitimate as opera. When she finished, the silence in the opera house lasted for what felt like minutes, but was probably only seconds. Pavarotti was staring at her, his expression unreadable. Then he started walking onto the stage, slowly, his hands clasped behind his back like a professor considering a particularly interesting thesis. Miss Houston, he said quietly, that was extraordinary. The technique, yes, very good. You study opera? No, Maestro, I study gospel, in church, since I was 5 years old. Gospel, Pavarotti repeated slowly, as if testing the word on his tongue. This is Black American religious music, yes? From the churches? Yes, sir. From the Black church specifically. It's its own tradition, going back hundreds of years. African rhythms mixed with Christian hymns, creating something entirely new. With how do you say, the decorations, the extra notes that you add? We call them runs, or riffs, or melismas if you want the technical term. It's improvisation within the melody structure. Like jazz, but sacred. Like what you do with cadenzas in opera, but more emotional. Less about showing technical skill, more about expressing what words alone can't say. Pavarotti nodded slowly, his eyes distant as he processed this. I see now. And this technique, this gospel technique, you learn this in church, not in conservatory, not with teachers who studied at Milano or Juilliard? That's right, 3 services every Sunday, sometimes revival meetings that last for hours. You learn to sing with power but without tension, with emotion but without strain. Different training than conservatory, but still training. Now Pavarotti looked troubled, but not in a dismissive way, in a genuinely thoughtful way. Miss Houston, he said carefully, now I have a question for you, and you must be honest with me. Can you sing I Will Always Love You the way you sing it? With all the gospel decorations, the belting, the emotional breaking in the voice? Can you teach me to do this? Whitney smiled. Maestro, I can try, but I don't think your voice has that training, just like mine doesn't have 40 years of opera training. Would you like to try? Yes, I would like to try. So there, in the empty Teatro Pavarotti, one of the strangest and most beautiful musical exchanges in history took place. Whitney taught Pavarotti the opening of I Will Always Love You, not the Dolly Parton country version, the Whitney version, with the gospel runs, the belt up to that impossible B-flat, the emotional catch in the voice that made the whole world cry when they heard it in The Bodyguard. Pavarotti tried. He really did. His face showed intense concentration, the same focus he brought to the most demanding Verdi arias. But his voice, so perfectly trained for opera, so magnificent in its classical purity, so controlled and disciplined, couldn't do what Whitney's voice did naturally. He couldn't make his voice break with emotion while staying on pitch. He couldn't access that gospel pocket where the rhythm sits slightly behind the beat, creating that swing feel. He couldn't add runs without losing the melody entirely. Every time he tried to add a riff, his operatic training kicked in and corrected it back to classical purity. After several attempts, Pavarotti stopped. He was breathing hard, not from vocal strain, but from the sheer mental effort of trying to make his instrument speak a language it had never learned. Sweat beaded on his forehead. "Madonna," he said, shaking his head. This is much more difficult than I thought. This gospel singing, it is its own technique, its own mastery. Just like opera is its own technique," Whitney said gently. "Different languages, both real singing, just different dialects." Pavarotti looked at her for a long moment. Then something shifted in his face. The maestro, the legend, the man who had defined operatic excellence for a generation, smiled with genuine humility. "Miss Houston, Whitney, I must tell you something. I was wrong. I have been wrong for many years. I thought opera was the only real singing because it is the most difficult. But now I see there are many ways to be difficult, many ways to master the voice. I study for 40 years to sing Puccini with beauty and control. You study in the church to sing gospel with power and emotion. Both require mastery. Both require years of training. Both are real." He extended his hand. "I apologize for my arrogance. You are not an entertainer with a microphone. You are an artist with a different education. And your education is just as valid as mine." Whitney took his hand. "Maestro, there's nothing to apologize for. You're protecting your art form. I respect that. But there's room for all of us." "Yes," Pavarotti said thoughtfully. "Yes, there is room for all of us. And tonight, when we perform together, I will listen differently. I will listen to your technique, not just your popularity." That night's performance became legendary. When Whitney and Pavarotti sang their duet, a specially arranged version of "I Will Always Love You" with operatic arrangements, something magical happened. They met in the middle. Pavarotti added emotional coloring he'd never used. Whitney used classical placement that honored the acoustic space. Opera meeting gospel, classical meeting contemporary. Two masters, now respecting each other completely. But the real impact came years later. After that night, Pavarotti never dismissed pop vocalists as not real singers. He became one of Whitney's most vocal defenders in the classical world. When opera purists criticized his pop collaborations, he would tell them about the day Whitney Houston sang Puccini in his opera house. "She taught me," Pavarotti would say, "that there are many ways to reach God through voice. Opera reaches God through precision. Gospel reaches God through surrender. Both are sacred, both are difficult, both are real." In 2007, when Luciano Pavarotti died, Whitney was devastated. She released a statement revealing what that day in Modena meant. "Maestro Pavarotti changed my life in ways the public never knew. He was the first from the classical world to treat my gospel training as legitimate musical education, not just natural talent. He understood my voice was not less than classical voices, simply trained in a different church. Both churches lead to the same heaven. He validated an entire tradition of Black American vocal training the classical world had ignored for centuries. For that, I will be forever grateful." The lesson from that day in the Teatro Pavarotti wasn't about who was the better singer. Pavarotti and Whitney were both geniuses of their respective genres. The lesson was about respect, about understanding that mastery comes in many forms. That technique doesn't only mean classical placement and conservatory training. Gospel singing, born in Black American churches, developed over centuries, passed down through oral tradition rather than written notation, is every bit as sophisticated as opera. The runs, the riffs, the emotional breaking, the power without tension. These aren't signs of undisciplined singing. They're signs of a different discipline. Whitney Houston didn't need to prove she could sing opera. She needed the opera world to recognize that gospel was its own art form. And in Luciano Pavarotti, she found the one classical legend humble enough to admit he'd been wrong. Two languages, two techniques, two worlds. One universal truth. Real singing is real singing, no matter what dialect it speaks. If this story moved you, hit that subscribe button. Share it with anyone who needs to hear that their training, their background, their way of doing things is valid, even if it's different from the traditional path. Drop a comment about a time someone dismissed your skills, only to realize later you'd mastered something they didn't understand. Because sometimes the greatest lessons come from the moments we're brave enough to say, "Let me show you something."